Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a basic CRUD app or create, read, update, delete app in the browser using IndexedDB and vanilla JavaScript. So I'm going to be bundling this app using Vite. So I will cd into my code folder, and then I will npm create Vite at latest, and I will call this IndexedDB notes app. So it's going to be a basic note-taking app that's going to go over all the basic CRUD operations and use IndexedDB to save them in the browser so that when you come back it'll be there. I will use the code keyword to open VS Code in IndexedDB notes app folder and bring that over here, switch to the terminal in here with Control Shift and tick mark, and npm I to install dependencies, and then I'm going to npm run dev to run the development server. So this is what the app looks like to begin with, and I want to get started by just fixing this icon to something of my own and changing the title of the site. So I'm going to search for emojis and just use a text emoji to create my icon. So I'll search for note and I'll take this spiral notepad, copy that emoji, which is just like text, and I'll use Figma, which is a design tool you can use in the browser, or you can download it as well. And I'll create a frame. I'll make that, let's say, 500 by 500. And I'll make it red so I can find it. And I lost it. So here it is. I guess I'll just make it 885 and change the background color to green, and then I will throw some text on here. It's gonna be, I'm just gonna paste that, so this is a character because it's an emoji. So I'll increase the size a little bit, or I can just lock the aspect ratio of the frame, I guess, and drag it smaller. So move this inside the frame, just select those two and center them vertically and horizontally, and that should be good enough. So because it's a emoji text, I'm not going to be able to do an SVG scalable graphic. I'll have to do a PNG, but that's fine, it's just an icon. So I'll export the frame as a PNG, and then I'm going to go to this IDB Notes app inside my code folder. Somewhere. Maybe it's just, okay, there it is. And then public folder is where the icons and such will get served out of. I'll call it notes. And then close this. In my public folder I'll have notes, so I'll delete Vite SVG, and I'll search the project for Vite.svg and replace it with notes.png. And that way in my index.html I should now have notes.png, and you'll see that up there. So I'll call this IDB notes, and then I'll start to organize the HTML the way I want it. So let's just keep that over there and make this a little bigger. So I'm going to move my script tag before the body, and I'm going to defer it because it's before. Then I'm going to remove this div inside of here, and I'm going to add a header, and I'm going to add a main. And actually, I already know I'm going to want a body that's going to be a flex column. I want a flexbox column so that things can be responsive. So I'm going to do that by using the class names, and I'll have those names be flex and call. So I'll do body.flex and then add space to add a new class of call, and then I'll add the same classes to my main as well. So I'll do header, and then my main content is going to be a flex column too. Okay, so now in my header I can put an h1 for the title of the page, so I'll do h1.page-title. Oh, and I actually wanted that to be ID of page title. And that's just a shortcut to add ID, is using the query selector. So we'll call it the IDB notes. And the styling is not what I want, but that's okay. I can change that in a bit. That's just default styling. But first, since right now I know that the JavaScript file that's getting imported here is where the CSS is coming in. So I'm going to take that out because I'm going to end up just pulling the style script in this way with a link CSS. So link, I'll use the Emmet shortcut for CSS, and it's going to be at / and instead of this, which is at the root of the kind of the deployed site or the server, this is the source code. So main.js is going to come from the source code, and then also the CSS is going to come from the source code, so the bundler can throw it together for us. And now the style is coming back in, so I can go and edit that style. So typically with these Vite styles, I like to remove pretty much everything except for the root stuff and the media query for the light color scheme for people who like light. I don't like light, but some people do. And then I'll also go and add some larger font sizes on root. So I'll do font size medium for now, and I'll add that on root. I'm also going to need it on button. I'm also going to need it on text area, so I can have and I can do it on input as well. So I can have a text area with larger text, easier to see. And right now I'm at 100% zoom, so that's how things are going to look on a screen like this. And then now you'll see that the things have gone up to the top. It can also help just to differentiate things, to give some colors on the parts of the visible screen that we've seen here. So for example, you could do HTML and then do background color pink, let's say, and then we'll do this for body, and then main, and we'll just add different colors on each one so that we can see where things are starting and ending. Can be an easy visual way to kind of debug the layout. So you can already see that if I think that my main is everything, it's clearly not. So that's a bit of a challenge. And also have my background color is this for something on the site above HTML, which is the root, evidently. So we probably don't need this one. Let's just see how we can get body kind of filling up the whole screen, since body is logically everything on the screen. So we'll need to set margin to 0 because it autos to 8 pixels or something like that. And then I also want to make sure that it takes up a minimum of the whole screen height. So I'll do min height, the viewport 100 VH, the 100% of the viewport height. And now we get scroll bars, which is annoying, and there's no margin here, but the margin's actually coming, if you check the box model, the margin's actually coming from the heading. So we can try a couple things to solve that. We could obviously go to the heading styling and try to fix it there. I'm going to choose a little bit of a more gentle color here for my viewing experience. And we can also make the body sizing to be box sizing of order box. This is going to help us in a minute, but for now what I'm going to do is make sure that this this heading is not going to push the margin up like that. So right now we have body being a flex column, and we have header is here, and then the H1 is inside of there. So let's see how we can add our flex classes to actually get this acting like a flex box. So we added them onto the DOM, but we didn't actually add them into the CSS. So for flex, the default is a flex row. So for the .flex class, I'm just going to make it display flex. And already you see it's solved that margin problem, because now it's letting, it's not a block display in this container. It's in the body container and the main container. It's now flex display. And then we can also make a flex column for the call class. Now call is a little bit of a generic name for this, but since I'm controlling all the CSS, I can pick whatever name I want. Now I don't like how now, I like what the margin in the body that's default does, so I want to add that back, but I want to add it as padding so that it's actually inside the edge instead of outside the edge. So I'm going to add a padding, but since I'm starting to use spacing, I'm going to create a CSS variable so I can use the same spacing amount all over my app. So I'll do color. I'll just add a color I might want to use later, like a gray color for some borders. So I'll do a color gray and pick some gray color. And then I'll do a gap standard, so a standard gap between different things, and I'll do 0.75 root ems, so the roughly 3/4 of the height of an M character in the root of the DOM. So now I can add that padding of variable gap standard, and we get that padding, and now we're getting scroll bars again. This is where box sizing comes in. The standard box sizing value is going to cause us to have scroll bars, whereas this box sizing, a border box, is going to make sure that we're fitting within that border box. And because it's a flex box, it will get larger down, it will grow down beyond min height of you know, this 100% viewport height. We don't want to fix that height to 100% because we want to be able to scroll if the content gets too big. And that's why we're using a flex column in this case. So let's just get a sense of how to do some flex items, because if we're going to have a note app with lots of notes, we probably want to be able to view those notes in a nice responsive way. So for now, I'll just create a little div.box. I'll create a class called box, and I'll just put a bunch of divs here. And it doesn't really matter what's in here. They're just kind of to experience what our layout is like. And so I'll create a .box class. Dot means class. And I will give it a background color of something sea green, and then I'll give it they have to have a little bit of height and a little bit of width in order to have a size at all to grow from. So I'm just going to give them a height or a min height of 1 centimeter, and then a min width and height of 1 centimeter. And already they're growing to fill this entire space because it's a flex box, but you'll see that there it looks way bigger than 1 centimeter in terms of the height, and the reason for that is that there's no gap between these. So conveniently we have flex class that where anything that we want a gap between, we could just use our variable from earlier. So I'll just take this gap standard and use that for the gap inside the flex box. And this will control both the vertical gap and the horizontal gap. So if we didn't want that, we would have to choose something else. And you might wonder, why is there yellow between there? Well, that's just the main showing through. Main has that background color, and so we can tell that this is part of main as well, and not part of the body, which is this blue background color. So those colors are just kind of helping us get a visual when we can't really tell where things live and where they end. That's a way to tell. So I don't really necessarily need this. It was just kind of for debugging, and you can see now I have these nice rows that are filling out to do the whole space. And if you're wondering why there's a scroll bar, it's just because we're overrunning the content, which is the desired behavior. If you have too much note size, you still want to be able to view those notes. So here, no scroll bar, and then if we get too small, we'll have a scroll bar, which is the ideal behavior in terms of what I'm wanting to do. At this point, I think it's fine to pull off the background color of that, and we don't really need to use divs, but it's good to know that things are working here, so I can just comment these out in case we want to use them later to debug. But for now, we're going to get into adding some different note sort of view using JavaScript. So in the JavaScript file, I don't really need any of this stuff. I don't want any of this, including the CSS. I've already handled that. So now I'm just going to want query selectors or get element by ID stuff that can grab different parts of the page so that we can edit them. So there's this main area, and we're probably going to want to have two basic areas, like a control area for adding notes and clearing notes, and then we'll want to have a notes area that's for having individual notes just like you have here. So what I'll do is do a div with the flex class, so that's going to make it a flex row but not a flex column, so things are going to be arranged left to right. And then I will do an unordered list, because this would be good semantic HTML, because I'm going to have multiple items of the same type of thing. It's really logically a list. So the styles aren't going to look perfect at first, but remember that styles aren't the same as the meaning of the HTML tag. So this is an unordered list, or actually more accurately, it's an ordered list, because the first note maybe comes before the second and so on. But in this case, I don't necessarily care about the order, because I'm not going to change the order, so I'll just make an unordered list. And so since I'm going to want these to both be logically, I'm going to call these areas. I'm going to call this the flex area class. And then I'll make an ordered list area, and that's going to be dot flex as well, but then it's going to have flex call and area. So it's going to be a flex column so that things are arranged downward, and it's going to be an area, whatever that class is going to be for me, so that I can style these two things separately. Then inside the control area, I'm going to have a button that's going to be the ID of clear, say, delete all button, and then that will say delete all notes. As much of this as you can put right in your HTML, the better. So I'm going to make this one to be create note button. Create new note. And you see this is a flex row, so things are getting arranged left to right. And then in here, these are going to be where my LIs are going to go for each of my notes, but I don't have any notes yet. So if I wanted to just create one just to kind of get the styling down, I could say, kind of mock up what this is going to look like. So I'll give this since this is a test, I'll just do it li pound test dash li, test list item, and then I'll do a text area so we can edit the note and view it at the same time and not have to make two different states there. So we'll do a text area of, since it's not going to be inside of a form, I don't need to do the form control stuff. I can just make it a text area and give it the ID of text area. And the styling isn't great, but it's something, so that's cool. And now we can work with that styling to get things looking the way we want. And inside the list item, we'll also want a button, not save, but we'll want this to be button pound delete note test button. Except I want that to be the dash delete note test button. Now I'm going to quickly do a little split screening so that I don't get my IDs wrong. It's easy to make mistakes in JavaScript without checking your IDs carefully that you get them wrong. So I'm just going to make some basic utility functions that I can apply to this list item, but then also to other list items as well. So I know I'm going to need to, for example, know when the text area changes. So I can get that function started. Function on text input, on text area input, and this can figure out the note ID and then get the new value and then update the note in the database and then refresh the view. That's one thing I know I'm going to have to do. I'm also going to need a function on delete click. So same thing, figure out the note ID, delete the note in the database, and refresh the view. We're also going to need some kind of handler for delete all notes. That's going to be delete all notes in the database, refresh the view. We'll need function create empty note, create a new note in the database, and refresh the view. And that's a pretty good start there. So now it'd be good to get a handle on some of our basic content here. So we know that we're going to have the clear button. So const delete all button is going to be, I guess I'm sort of mixing the IDs here, delete all button. So it's using query selector. Yeah, that's fine. Delete all button and create note button. Those IDs look right. And then the notes container is going to be this. I'm going to call it the notes UL area, the notes unordered list area. And so that is the UL, but it has no ID. So I'll give it the ID equals notes list or notes list area. Then we'll need a function to update UL notes area, or actually more accurately, this is going to be update the notes refresh notes view. And I don't want that to take a parameter for now. So it's going to have to essentially figure out what the notes are. So sure, we could get all notes from the database. Then we can essentially replace the contents of the notes area with the new notes. We're also going to need to create the note, we have that. So why don't we add our event listeners for these two, at least so they're hooked up. So delete button event listener, delete all notes. That should work fine. We don't necessarily need the event accessible, so this should be fine. And then we'll do create note button, create empty note, and when the input event happens on the notes area, no, this is not right. We don't want to do that. So now we probably need some way to at least test that these things are working. And to do that, let's just throw a console.log on text area input, and this is going to take an event. So we will console.log that, and then new value is going to be event.target.value. So we can console.log the new value when the text area changes. And we'll have to hook that up to our test for now. So we'll do const test text area is ID is going to be test dash text area. Then we will just add that event listener, text area dot add event listener input on text area input, and we can go ahead and see what happens when we type in this. So now as we change, we're getting this. We refresh the page, it's going to go away because it's just editing the DOM. There's no actual persistence of this. And we can at least hook up the part of this that that adds things and subtracts it, but we're not really going to be editing the DOM directly. We're going to be basing everything on the contents of the database. So now I just want to focus on getting this styled the way that I want it, and then can move on from there. So this is a great time to put my background color back on so I can see what's going on here. So I have that one, and then my dot box is right here. If I wanted to, I could throw my dot box onto my list item so I can get a sense of where that is. So this is my list item, and you'll notice that the unordered list is right here. It's not including the green is the list item, and so the list area is what has the unordered list is what has the bullet that I don't want. And if we look over, it's also what has here the padding right here. The padding is actually on the list item itself. It's not a margin. Sorry, it's not a margin on the list item. It's a padding on the unordered list. So that's where we're going to need to change unordered list, and we can get that by its ID, which is this. So in here we can do a pound for ID, and then that ID, and just give it a let's see, padding 0. So now that's all the way to the left, and style, list style, I think, none. So, sorry, the dog was eating the tennis ball. So now we can get back to this, and we'll see that we're correctly getting everything to be fully wide, which is good. It might be good if the areas, each of the areas, which we don't have a class for yet, had a little bit of padding or inside of them. So let's do dot area, since we added that class, and do a padding of gap standard. So we'll see that we're getting that to work. Inside of here, it's working. And then inside of here, this area, the padding seems to be getting overridden by this padding right here. So let's just add that like that, and then the padding will get set by the other one. And we'll see that the unordered list is also having some sort of spacing added to it as well. So there's a margin as well on that, which I don't think we added, so that must be a default. So let's add margin 0. And now that has the expected spacing. We also might want to add spacing between the items inside of each list item. So we could add, if we wanted to, we could see what happens if we add the area on here. So now we get that padding. And in terms of how things are getting spaced now, it's pretty reasonable. It might be based on the box class. So instead of doing a background color on the areas, let's have the areas have a border 1.5 pixels, solid, variable, color gray. So now we have gray outlines on all of those areas. And let's also do a border radius of the variable gap standard. A little bit more round than I would like, but that's fine. I'm going to get rid of this yellow background color, and that way I can kind of see all the different containers going on here. If we hover over this, there's no weird outlines or anything. This is just only so big. So now we probably want each list item to be a flex row, and then we can lay things out where the text area gets to kind of fill up and let the delete button just be to the right. So to do that, let's throw on the list item is already an area, but it needs to be a flex area. Okay, so now it's a flex row, and all we need is for this to get bigger, and that should be achievable with flex grow on the text area. So we could make a class for that as well of .grow, and that'll be flex grow of 1. And so everything we add that to will share that same ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 on all the ones we add it to. So I'll add that to the text area. And there we go, it's grown. Then we can resize this. I might not want the delete button to get quite so big, and so if I wanted to, I could add the delete button could have a center alignment, I believe, not justification. So I could do a class of align center, and then dot align center would be a align self of center. And so while the text area is stretching, the delete button itself is going to, instead of stretch, which is what it was, then it's going to be centered in the middle there. So as this gets bigger, the delete will be in the center, or we could even do flex start to keep it at the top there. All right, now I guess the last thing would be if we want to make each text area a little bit larger, we could, but this is fine for now. So only other thing, maybe if these borders are a bit small, or these corners are a bit round, so I'll do a gap small of 0.25 rem, and then I'll change the radius to gap small. Now those radii are a little bit smaller, and then 0.5, yeah, 0.25 is fine. And we don't really need these outlines, they're getting a bit busy. We can always put them back later if we want them. Maybe good to at least have a note class that kind of specifies what each list item is a class of note as well. And then we could put the .note class can have at least that border. And you could have area have it as well, and then just take area off of all the things it doesn't need to be on. So we can take it off the list item. Maybe we do want it on the list item, and then put it on the controls. We can call that controls. So now those are outlined together, and then the list of notes is outlined as well. Next, we can start to look at the data model. So for this, we're going to use IndexedDB, and there are suggested wrappers you can use for IndexedDB, but I'm just going to use native IndexedDB with no libraries, just to show that it's really not that complicated. It's known for being a bit complex, and the IDB library from NPM can help you a lot, but I'm just going to go through a completely native solution for this. Before I do that, I'll just delete these, and then it would also be a good time to commit the code, even if it's just locally. So I'll git init, and then we'll make a git ignore for a node project. Git add dot git commit dash m basic view setup, git status, and everything's there. Run the dev server again. Now to do this, it's going to be easier to keep this in another file for organization purposes. So I'm going to make as if I will import this, and I want it to import like a DB object I can work with, and then I also want to be able to, maybe import other things inside the curly braces with named exports, and so it'll be from db.js, which it hasn't created yet. So I'll create one of those, db.js, and in here I'm going to first start with a database name, and I'll call this the notes app db. Then I will do a open request, and that's going to be coming from global this, so the window object in this case, dot indexedb dot open, and then the name of the database, and that number would be the version, but I'm just going to let it assign the version as 1 to start with, And I'm going to create a line also to delete the database, which I wouldn't obviously want to do every time, but it's good for debugging to be able to uncomment that line and quickly clear out the database with the deletion. So to do that, I'll just call the global this.indexedb dot delete database and give that database name, and then I'll comment that line out. Now what we need to do is create an event handler that is going to what's called upgrade the database. So an upgrade is essentially like changing the schema. So the schema is the set of kind of structure for the tables that are in a database. A database consists of multiple tables, and the schema defines how those tables are designed. And so if we want to create tables or create indices on those tables, we have to do that during the open request. And so the way that you have to do that is by adding an onUpgradeNeeded function, so that when an upgrade is needed, so for example, the first time you open the database with version 1, it's going to set up the tables, and then all subsequent times the tables are already set up, so it won't run that upgrade function. So you would run like function handle upgrade, and this will take an event, and it will get the database from event.target.result. That will essentially mean that the result of the open request. So the open request is the target, and the result is the database API that we're trying to export from this entire file. So we'll do, once we have that available, we'll do db.createObjectStore. An object store is the not only SQL or NoSQL way of saying a table, essentially. So we're going to call that the notes table, and we're going to give it a key path of ID, which is a common way to index rows in a database table. And then we're also going to use that suggested auto increment true, which means that if we don't pass an ID, it'll just use a number for ID, and it'll add one to the previously added ID. So if we just added ID of 80 and then we add the next one, it'll add 81. Now this is the handler that's going to have to be attached to the open request, and the way that we do that is just to set the handler equal to that on this open request object. And note that this is below, but because it's a function, you can actually access things before they've been defined. That's just how JavaScript files work. And so you can do open request.onUpgradeNeeded equals handle upgrade, or you could just add an event listener for the upgrade needed event. So now that should create the table, and I'm just going to create my own little database object. This is a common pattern that we're going to export just to do the basic operations. And the way that I'm going to set this up is just simply not as a class. You could do this as a class and use the singleton pattern and make an instance of that class and export that instance. But to me, that's a little bit silly. So we're just going to make a basic JavaScript object called DB. And this, I'm going to point out the structure, since there are no types in JavaScript that are enforced. I'm going to make an API, which is going to be like the kind of the IndexedDB API that we're going to want. And then I'm going to set that to null to start. Then I want to do a ready promise, so this is going to be null as well, and so that's a promise. And I'm going to want to make each of the CRUD operations, so create, read, update, and delete. So I'll do C for create, and that will be null to start. Then I'll do read or retrieve, update, and delete. Now what I'll do, since sometimes you want to delete one thing or you want to delete everything, I'll do, handle one and all, and I'll do the same for read. For reading by ID, handle, by ID and all. Next, I will create a reopener function, and this is just going to be in case the database closes because of some other purpose that wasn't me intentionally closing it. Then I'll be able to reopen it so that this file's export can continue to work for my import in the main.js. So I'll do const reopen DB, and that will be an asynchronous, meaning it returns a promise. I don't need that because I'm not using any await in here, but it's just clear to say that it's async. And so I'll run some kind of setup function, and then I'll return the db.ready promise, because that is going to be the promise that says whether this opening happened correctly. Now, in terms of what that setup function will do, that can be function, and this could have also been an async function. So just to show you what that would look like, async function, just whether we use function keyword or not. So now we'll do a function of setup. And this is going to take that DB object that we're working on, but like a particular DB object. So it may not be this exact one, it may be a different one in the future. And so we can pass it in as an argument. And we can also pass in an open request. And what we're going to try to do is set the promise. So const promise DB, or really we can just set it right where we want to go. So DB, whatever this object is, which would look like this. We want to set the ready promise. db.ready is a new promise with resolve and reject, and it's going to do this open request. It's going to add an onSuccess handler. Now keep in mind, everything I'm doing is just a way to make this async compatible for my purposes. There are wrappers that do this for you, but it's quite simple to make a basic version yourself. And so you could just work with this API, but it has all these callbacks and it just gets kind of verbose and clunky. So we're going to create a new promise with resolve and reject, and on success we're going to set the db.api to be the result of the open request, and then we'll resolve that db API, except we want it to be more like, db, so we'll do something like API equals open request dot results, same thing as event dot target probably, and then we'll do db.api equals API, and then we'll do run a function. So on open, so when the open happens successfully, we can pass in that API to the open function so that it can set up our DB object for us. And so we could pass in the DB and the API. Then we can resolve the promise with nothing, because we just want the setup function to know when it's done. We don't necessarily care about a result. And then we can, on error, we can reject with the error. Now what we'll end up doing is calling the setup function like this. Since we've created that open request up at the top and we have a database, these can come in right here and then get used as parameters and then passed to an onDBOpen function. And ultimately we're going to just want to export the default database and export maybe reopen DB as a named export, for example. So finally, I'm going to create that most important function, which is the onDBOpen, and this is going to be the one that will set up all those CRUD operations. So by this point, the database should be successfully opened and we should be able to work with it. So a couple good things to set up here are and actually we have the database object here, and we've already set up the API is available. So we can do the db.api, stands for Application Programming Interface, the db.api.onVersionChange. So if somebody upgrades the database, we need to close it, and then we need to reopen the database as well. So a shorthand for that would be put this in parentheses, and then we could we don't really care about this event here, so I'll do it in an underscore, and so we'll do db.api.close, and then we'll do a reopen db right there. In the database, we'll get reopened on version change, closed and reopened. Then we can do a db.api.onClose and simply reopen the database. So contrary to what you might think, this event is not fired when you call close. It's only called when somebody else closes the database. Like basically when, for example, if something crashes or the tab gets closed at which point you don't really care, that's when that event gets fired. And so on error, we should probably handle errors, but right now, just for the basic functionality, I'm not going to handle that. So to do the create function, we'll need, we'll set it on the DB object like this, db.c equals, so we're assigning the previously null C that's on this database object that we passed in here to the setup function, which then calls onDBOpen with that DB and the API once it's ready, because this only happens when the API is ready. So down in here we will say this equals an async anonymous function that is going to take a new row that we want to add to the database, a new object, and what it's going to do is wait a couple of things. So really you could do promise.all, or you could just make an async function body like this and do await DB ready. You want to make sure the database is ready, and then you can create a new transaction. So we'll just simply return a new promise. This is an async function, so it has to return a promise, but this stuff is a synchronous API with callbacks. So we're going to create a read-write transaction on the store, on the notes store. We were requesting to add the row, and on success we need to resolve, and on failure we need to reject the error. So I would do this actually like on success we'll just resolve the result, and then on error we'll actually take that error and reject with that error. Now for db.read, we're going to actually need two functions. So we will do the await db.ready, and then we're going to say if the ID equal to undefined, meaning they did not pass in an ID, then they want to delete or get all. They want to read all. So we will call a function called read all, or like db read all. And that's going to have to be a promise as well. We'll just return the result of that. And then in other case, we will return db.read by ID of the ID. So now we can create those functions. db_read_all is going to be an async function, but really it's just going to return a promise. So it doesn't technically need to be async. We're going to resolve reject, create a transaction, but where is the DB API coming from? So we're going to need to pass into here the DB API. And then for the async function read by ID, that's going to use, this one was using store.getAll, so it creates a new transaction, gets the store for the note store from this transaction object, and then it gets all the values and returns the result, which also should come from this, should come from should have e.target.result. And we'll do the same format down here. Now this one is getting the store, but instead of doing get all, it's doing get, and it passes in the ID so that the API for IndexedDB can look up that particular object and return. Since we have only the ID, we want all of the properties of the object, not just the ID. Then we'll do the same thing for delete. We're going to need the same two things for delete. So I'll do an async function db delete all, and this is going to do a read-write transaction. Notice this one, these are read transactions, so they're read only. This one's a read-write transaction because we have to delete stuff. We're going to go into the notes. We're going to call the clear function on the notes store, and then we'll just resolve and reject any errors that come through. Do the same thing for delete by ID like we did with read, except it's a read-write transaction and we're deleting rather than clearing, and we're passing in that ID to delete the row with that particular ID. So all of this looks fine. We'll obviously have to test it all. Then the only one we'll have to write other than this is update. So await DB ready, resolve reject. We're going to do DB API transaction, a read-write transaction on the notes store, and we're going to put the row. Put is the meaning for insert it if it doesn't exist, and overwrite it if it does exist. So because we're going to pass in a row that already has an ID, we could update an existing row in the database. And then same pattern here, we're resolving nothing, we're rejecting any errors. And finally we'll hook up that delete, which will check if it's undefined, delete all if that's the case, otherwise delete by ID. And hopefully all the basic stuff is set up here. So we're calling our setup function, which will make this to collapse that. Our setup function is going to call on DB open to set up the database object with everything that we need, and then that one, once it is ready, is going to we need to make sure that db.ready is equal to something. Oh, yep, and I misspelled ready. So db.ready is equal to this, so that we'll know when this promise resolves, which happens here on success of the open request. When this when this ready resolves, then it's okay to start creating, reading, updating, and deleting. We set all those up inside the on db open, and we probably don't necessarily need the ready promise, but it's a good synchronization mechanism if we want to wait for other things to be done before saying the database is ready. So again, this is not the only way to set this kind of thing up. This is just the way I happen to set it up to keep things straight in my brain for using the raw IndexedDB global this API. So now let's see if we can import our DB as intended. And of course we already have an error. So DB is not defined at DB line 40. And that makes sense because it's not db.api, it's capital db.api. And now we need to see if we can just do some basic CRUD operations. So let's see if we can do top level await, because this is a module, a modern module. So we can do await db.ready, and then we can do await db.create hello world, and we can do, I'm getting another error at db.js line 45. All right. And then read with no ID passed in, and we'll console log notes if they come through. We seem to have a lot of this db, lowercase db, so we'll search for lowercase db and see if we need to replace it with capital db somewhere. Make this case sensitive. So replace that one, that one. That one, that one, and that one. And we have to make sure we await the setup function. And it'd probably be good to set the object.assign db to what comes back from this call. So we have that global DB getting all this stuff inserted into that. And so this one, this setup function, needs to actually return the DB. I'm going to issue at line 85. DB read all. Ah, and there's the problem. DB read all. We're passing in DB when we should be passing in db.api. Now everything's working. AI steered us wrong. All right. So now we've added lots of things here because we've never deleted the database. So you'd see if I recomment that convenience line here, now every time we reload the page, it'll just be one thing because it's deleting the database every time. But clearly we couldn't do that in our actual app, so have to be able to comment that out too. But this is good because we're getting different IDs added here, and you'll see they all say hello world, but they're getting their automatically assigned ID, which is great. Now it would be good to try adding maybe 3 of these and then testing some of our other functions. So we know we can just for now comment in the delete, so every time it's going to be those fresh 3 rows, and we're reading all. And then we can test to get, let's say, note 2. So const note 2 is read 2 and console.log 2, and we get the note with ID 2, so the read by ID seems to work. Then we'll do const, let's do await update, where we're going to set note 2 to be hello world updated, and we get an error. So that's at line 63. And we have db.api.transaction. There we go. Now we have no error. And we can do another check on note 2. So we'll do let note 2, and then we'll do note 2 is read note 2 console.log. There we've got the updated. Now let's see if we can delete note 1. And then we'll get all again. So we'll do a let here. Now we only have 2 notes, and the one that was removed was ID 1 because ID 2 and 3 are still there, so the delete by ID seems to work. And finally, we want to see if we can delete all notes, and so the notes should be empty once we do that, and that is working perfectly. So now all of this testing code can be commented out. And we don't strictly need to wait for DB ready either, because it's being awaited for inside of each of these. And I don't even think that it's necessarily make or break that we're waiting for that to begin with. Maybe I could be wrong. Yeah, I guess we won't really know. And we haven't, for some reason, we haven't waited for that in all of the functions. I guess down here, these are the ones we haven't waited for it. Oh, we don't have ready, that's why, because it's been waited for in each of these. We do have to wait it because these have to get set up, and we don't know when that's done until the until this promise resolves. So that's all. This function has to be done running before we try to call anything. So now we can use these functions inside of our DOM manipulation code. And I've left in a console log that I probably should take out. Alright, now getting close to hooking everything up here. So first, to get all the notes, we need a way to refresh the notes view. So we need to get all the notes from the database, as we've noted here. And so that would be const notes is await database.read, but this needs to be an async function for using await. And then we need to replace the content of the notes area UL with the new notes. So the notes area UL is this. So we'll clear the area, and then for each note we're going to create something, and I'm just going to create a function for this because this is going to get really messy really quickly. So we'll say for each note we're gonna say append note to view. And so function append note to view is going to create a list item with a text area and a button, but we have to make it look like our template that we've created here. So that's why this is a good starting point. I'll do Alt-Z to wrap the text. So for context, it'll help Copilot to see what this is going to look like. So I'll comment that out. And it's going to be const li, just like they had it. Create element li. I'm going to, the ID, sure, can be note.id, and I'm actually going to make sure that have that ID available to put in a couple places. So const note ID is note.id, and we'll do ID is note dash that number, and then the class list is going to need those things on it because those are here. Then there's going to be a text area, yes, but I also want to do li.dataset, so we get like a data attribute on there. And we'll do a text area. The text area is going to grow. It's also going to have, yes, a value of text, except it's not called text, it's called content. And then it'll have node ID in the data set, and it'll have a ID. No, we don't really need the ID. We'll do a delete button. And add that align center class. The delete button, yeah, I guess we can put the data set on there too. And then we'll add a click listener and do on delete click, which is a function we've made but not implemented. Then we will append the text area as a child of the list item, append the button, and then put the list item as a child of the unordered list. Then to implement this, we'll say const note ID is going to come from this .dataset.noteID, so those are those data attributes on the DOM. And then we can make this an async function and await delete, and then we could refresh the notes view, or we could also just remove this from the DOM individually. but refreshing should be fine. So let's see what happens here. So append note to view. Is being done here, but this function is never being called in the global scope. So let's call that initially on DOM content loaded fresh notes view. And we can add a couple of these notes in. And we have a problem here because we're awaiting read, but we have to await db.ready first. So I can actually just put that on the global scope, just so that the database is ready before we start doing this. But okay, so that is working as intended. Except for this piece right here. So we can check the application tab to see what's in the database. So there's a table called notes, and we have a couple of these. Clearly those are not all getting shown here. So let's see why that is. Alright, and we just have one note in the database. Ah, okay, we need this line below. There we go. it's pulling out each of the notes. Getting each of those notes, and it says contents. So you make sure that it's adding the value there. There we go. Hello world. And I guess we can also just make sure that the database is ready before this export happens here. And there we go. Not working. We might need the window load event. I suppose we can just have it on the global scope. I'm not sure why that event listener isn't working. Probably because I've used it or something. But now we can get the notes view updated, and we have the delete button being called, and the delete function will delete a note supposedly. So say console.log. So it's getting the ID that needs to be deleted, but then it's not actually deleting it, perhaps. And I think I know why. This is needs to be a number, but it's actually a string right now. So now it'll delete and refresh because we called refresh. So I'll remove the console log there. And then I'll also, wait, I need to remove delete click. And 22, line 22. All right. So now we need to make the text area to handle change. So that will be event listener on input, text area input. So we get those. And then we're also going to, from that, need to figure out what is the ID that we're working on. So the note that we're working on is this ID. The new value is this. And so we need to update the database. Make this async. Await, update the database. And then we could refresh notes, or we could also just sync a text area from a particular from its database condition. So make a function for that function, just to be sure that this update didn't fail, because the DOM will change, and we can see that if we, well, of course we're deleting the whole database every time. So I'll just get rid of this deleting thing, and it'll create those every time. But then what I want to do is, inside of main, when I'm creating these, I'll just only do this if the database is not empty. So const db size is length of the array that comes back when we read. So if database size is 0, we'll add 3 rows. Otherwise, we will not add 3 rows. Then now if I reload the page, we should have just that 1. Whereas if I delete and reload, I should get 3 back. Now, to sync, like right here, if we do this and reload, it saves. But if there were some sort of error updating this, we would want to resync and make sure that the DOM is in sync with the database. So sync text area with DB. So that'll be const node ID is the data set on the DOM. So this is coming from the DOM. If we look at one of these, here's an example. See, it has this data-note-id. I didn't put that, but the data prefix is how the browser handles data sets. So when you assign something to a data set, it gives this particular attribute, and it's splitting out note ID into note-id here. Then we'll say we'll need to pass to this the text area element. So we'll read that, set the value to make sure they're synced up. Make this an async function, and then we will await sync, and this, I guess that does work. I would prefer to use event.target. I guess we need to use this. Okay, yes, so that was working. We don't need to use this. At least I don't think so. We just need the text area element .dataset.noteID. That's fine. And then reload, does it stick? Yeah, it sticks. So everything seems to be working good there. And we should be able to change any of those, reload the page, and it sticks around. And that is the updating portion. We know the deleting portion is working. We're refreshing with 3 if there's nothing. And then we still need create note and delete all notes. So for delete all notes, make these async functions. Create new note in the database will be await create empty refresh. So create, now that works. And for delete, we'll do delete all notes in the database, delete with no parameters, and then refresh. Delete all, create new, delete all, create new, delete, refresh, and it works. All right, so I'll do a get status, get add source DB, say get commit -m simple CRUD wrapper for IndexedDB, and then get status. We still have main to commit, get add source main, get commit -m connecting view to DB logic. Clean up a little bit, get rid of all these things, and really we could move this creating a test note over to the database file as well. And we could move all this stuff to the bottom of the file as well. Check that that works okay. So delete all notes, reload, my first note, create notes, delete a note, reload, edit some notes, reload. Everything's fine, and you can see I can even close down the browser and reopen it, and my notes are still there, which is the whole point of this note-taking app. And I know, I went through things kind of slowly, but by very carefully setting up the view logic and then setting up the database logic and then connecting the two, kind of handled the complexity one piece at a time rather than trying to put everything together at once, and that can be confusing sometimes. So in summary, what we did here was to create a vanilla JavaScript app that uses the built-in IndexedDB in the browser with no libraries to create a simple CRUD app. So to do that, we had to make an upgrader function that created the notes object store to store the data. We only have one table or one object store in this app, but you can have multiple. And once that gets created the first time, it doesn't have to get recreated in the future. And then we created a simple database object that we could do the different operations for and wait for a promise for when the database object was ready to use. And I guess we forgot to do this reopen function, so should probably add that as well, which would be essentially calling the setup function and then returning the database ready. So we create a reopen function in case the database closes, that we can have that called. We create a setup function that assigns a promise so that when the database is done opening, then we can begin to set up our API. And our setup involves defining an async function for each action we want to do, creating, reading, updating, and deleting, in which you have to create a transaction, access the store, request to do a certain action, and then handle the success or error callback for that request. So we took all that packaged up stuff, we waited, we did a setup, awaited a setup, and then here I can await that as well. We waited a setup and then awaited the database to be ready. We checked if the length was non-zero, and if it was 0, we would create a starter note for the user, and otherwise we just let them use their own notes and don't add more. We export this API that we created so that we can import it in our main file, and then just do very simple async await, read, write, update, and delete. So created different DOM elements, a way to refresh a notes list, and hook up event listeners to click, and input handlers so that we can just automatically save data as we start to make changes in the UI, and the user doesn't have to set any click any kind of save button. Everything is just sort of saved automatically, like you would experience in like Google Docs or something like that. And the great thing about this, because in IndexedDB we can have other tables, but also the tables that we have in this, the single table we have in this app will be saved between browser sessions. And so it's a great way to have your application data be stored in the user's browser, rather than having to host your own server to have an application that lets you have data saved between sessions. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.